Meaningless, meaningless, utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. Generations come and generations go, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises and the sun sets and hurries back to where it rises. The wind blows to the south and turns to the north, round and round it goes, ever returning on its course. All streams flow into the sea, yet the sea is never full. To the place the streams come from, there they return again. I'm an undergraduate biology and environmental studies double major. I'm a Christian and I grew up on a lake, which has heavily influenced everything that I do and am. It influences the science and the background that I bring into my observations. Living on a lake, you're so close to the intricacies of God. You see these beautiful relationships forming. They're symbiotic and you almost get to be a part of it. I found a lot of joy in recreation, fishing, paddleboarding, kayaking, but I've also found a lot of sadness as I've grown up and realized what was happening to our lake, what was happening to our water.
And when I first moved on Minnetonka, there was a lot of Eurasian milfoil in the lake, and at first it didn't seem like it was an issue, but as the years went by, it started getting more prolific, and different channels and bays would get clogged with it. People couldn't get their boats off the docks, because there was a bunch of weeds behind it. And then about maybe 10, 12 years ago, maybe longer, they started to try to get rid of it. And what happened then is that the lake started getting a little bit dirtier, because the milfoil would filter out contaminants and debris, and the fish population started, I don't know if it dropped or what, but now we have pondweed, and then shortly after that, the zebra mussels moved in.
I think science is really important for children to learn. You have reading and writing, which helps you learn how to communicate. You have math, which communicates different information, statistics, economics, time. History is the ongoing story of our world. But science really does it all. It's communication, it's history, it's a connection to oneself, one's community, it's learning and discovery, and it's not over. Science is really important for children because it reflects this intersectionality of the world. I had the privilege of growing up in a STEM school, which really fostered this deep, rich connection to the environment from a very young age. In the same way, I think science is really important for women to be in. Why do you think science is important for women specifically?
For so many reasons. So many reasons. But when we think about sort of like who were the knowledge holders of plant knowledge, who were the holders of that knowledge, who were the ones that were passing that knowledge down to the next generation. A lot of times that was women historically. I guess I take a larger view of what data is, so I feel like data is not only from sort of like empirical studies, but it is long-term accumulated human experience that has led to a more complex understanding of the way that the world works. And women were a part of that story, and then sort of were excluded from all of that story when we start to take this more narrow empirical sort of more Western scientific approaches to how science needs to get done. But also minorities have been very excluded too. And so I think when we talk about women, we're also talking about sort of like any minoritized group. And it wasn't until 1993 that Congress passed a law that women have to be included in like medical studies. And so then they were always using male bodies as proxies for females. But the female body is very different than the male body for a lot of reasons. And so having females, A, included, but B, also driving what questions get asked are really important when it comes to women's health. It's just really important to have women be a part of the conversation. And I think as we see sort of like more women being incorporated into sort of what was historically male-dominated spaces, you would hope that that would lead to like the empowerment of more women to move into those spaces, or at least to start to feel comfortable in those spaces, or to have women elevate other women, which is always really complex, right? Like it doesn't always happen, but that would be sort of like the hope for that. And so women have been doing science forever. It's just whether or not they have had their voices included.
I do feel certain pressures in science. I had a challenging time picking out an outfit for my spring conference, in which I was presenting my semester's research, because I wasn't sure what would be considered professional as a woman. Attending a Christian high school as a woman, science was just not for me. It was the idea of my science teacher, who taught both chemistry and biology for most of the school, that ecology wasn't necessary. It just wasn't focused on enough. We dissected animals without ever learning how to protect them. One day in class, she told us that environmental science was stupid, that God would save everything anyways.
It's really loaded. It is hard, like working in a lab or being in a science class where like the majority of people don't look like you. But honestly, I feel like in a lot of my classes, like it is almost majority women, which has been nice. I feel like the spaces that I have in where it's like a lot more men than women, like that is kind of hard. But I feel like the biggest thing is like the combo of being a woman plus also being young plus like I'm short. The woman in STEM stuff is a little bit overstated. Makes me feel babied a little bit, because sometimes all like the woman in STEM stuff makes me feel like I didn't really earn my place in science, rather like it was given to me in order to get more women into the field, when like really I feel like being a woman hasn't impacted me that much in science. Like I've done a lot of this on my own. Being a Christian in science, that is hard because like I don't really believe in evolution. I believe in creation. And when, like if you speak up at all about that, then people are like, oh, you don't believe in science then. Like that's not real. When really that's not the case. I do believe in science, and I believe that all of science is God's creation. Like all the laws of physics, all the laws in chemistry, like all of that is something that God created. Which is how I see God in my science for sure too, because I had to kind of shift my mindset from being frustrated with how abstract things are, rather to being kind of in awe of how complex it is and how like privileged I am to be here learning about God's creation. Like it is such a cool thing to be able to like have classes where I'm learning about the things that God made.
My intersectional identities, being a woman, being a Christian, growing up on a lake, all of these play a role in the science that I do. We look to Indigenous scientists, trans scientists, Black scientists, female scientists, and we see that there's a strong effort going both into their science and to the work to break down perpetuated biases. Science is for everyone, both for the small and the large voices. Because a person who practices science knows of themselves, knows of their history, and knows of the creation story that's ever being written. calling pet cockroaches, you kind of get mixed reactions. My roommate likes them, but I've been told that they're kind of creepy or weird. I think there's this cultural conditioning that really goes into the United States that tells us to be afraid of insects or just afraid of animals that we're not comfortable with. In a way, we kind of see this with gender and sexuality. Anything outside of these binaries, we're kind of conditioned to be wary of.
So my first question is, what is deisi, and what other ways do we see gender in nature?
So the first part of that question is easy. It's when you have separate plants that either produce pollen, and pollen have sperm in them, or they produce ovules, and ovules have the eggs in them. And so for humans, it's kind of easy for us to conceive of those things because that's sort of what we do if we want to be really simplistic. But yeah, it's this idea of separate individuals that do one or the other. So I think gender, especially when we think about humans, is a very complex topic. But in botany, sort of the term that we use for a flower that has both pollen and ovules, we call those perfect flowers. Like that's the perfect state. And then anything else is imperfect. And so I think that is a real contrast to sort of like maybe the labels that humans put on ourselves. What is natural? That means sort of like a continuum of what we might think of as gender, and also a continuum of what we might think of as sexuality. I think for me, when we think about how science can be exclusionary, I want to make sure that my class isn't excluding people who maybe are on a continuum of gender, or don't think of themselves, just because they produce sperm, they don't identify as a male. And so I've tried to sort of like tighten that language a little bit to say gender is a continuum, but we can kind of simplify it into sort of like, do you produce sort of sperm or do you produce ovules? And then it avoids this idea of like males only do one thing and females only do one thing, because you could certainly identify as another gender, but maybe have organs that produce a certain kind of sex cell. So that's...
Then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness." Genesis 1:26. It's been questioned over and over, what is the likeness of God? Traditional Christianity points to the metaphors of God as king and God as father. But in reality, God is a mother, a potter, a healer, an advocate, and a judge. There's gendered and agendered roles for God. And in the same vein, God is a trinity. Humanity is made in the likeness of an inseparable spirit, true man and true God. United in Christ, Galatians 3 tells us that there is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. Humanity is gendered after God, whose gender encompasses all forms and lack thereof. If creation, chordates, ferns, cnidarians, amoebas, hermaphroditic porifera, and people proclaim genderqueerness, it is a reflection of a genderqueer God. So I woke up this morning and Fiora had babies.
So I've been raising about 1,000 to 2,000 Artemia for the past 2 weeks or so. How it came about is we had a biology lab where we were going to be studying these Artemia. We had 4 groups in the class, 6 petri dishes, about 50 eggs per petri dish, and we were going to control the conditions that they hatched in. And then I began thinking, well, there's 8 sections across this Bio 102. What are we gonna do with all the Artemia after we're done? So naturally I asked my professor, and
What's difficult in scientific fields is that there's no room for emotion. It's something that's illustrated quite well by intersectional scientists. What especially comes to mind is the book Braiding Sweetgrass and the idea of indigenous practices in ecology and biology. That deep-rooted emotional and spiritual connection to land and animal and plant is not seen as scientific. And what scientists with intersectional identities are starting to consider is, does it have to be devoid of emotion and connection to have merit?
So I'm a teenage girl. I catch the exchanged looks between my peers. I know when we kind of realize that there's this weirdness, there's this difference between us. I told some of the peers in my class that I was going to be saving the Artemia, and I definitely was met with these mixed responses. I know it's silly to save them. They're invertebrates that don't live long. They are fed to aquarium fish.
I know, that's what I'm worried.
This is day one of the Artemia. I just rescued them from the lab. And while I was in there, I was talking to the lab professor, and she said, you know, this is kind of traumatic for them. And I think that's really sad. I think it's more of a reason to do this, to rescue them, but to be subjecting these animals, even if they're small, even if they're invertebrates, to this very traumatic thing and then letting them die is honestly cruel. So I go back tomorrow to rescue more, but they're doing okay right now.
Biology and ecology really depend so much on the scientist's background. These studies and projects, they're the culmination of these different stories coming together. Saving the shrimp is important to me because of my theology. I have this idea about our ecological role as people. Earlier this year, I wrote an essay for my environmental class, and it tied in this book, Extraordinary Insects by Anne Sverdrup Thyssen. She wrote, "We humans have a moral duty to rein in our dominance of the earth and give our millions of fellow creatures a chance to live out their tiny, wonderful lives too." So here's my multitudes. If we go back to Genesis 1:26, it starts with, "Then God said, 'Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness.' But then it finishes with the assignment, 'so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground.'" We're called to be these stewards of creation. So if we take science and ecology as it truly is, this deep love, this deep passion, this acknowledgement that humanity is not above nature but is nature, we can begin to leave space for this other.
He's smiling at you. And that is a bullhead, I believe.
If we follow feminist thought and theory, leaving space for this other, we begin to see animals as the complex creatures that they are. And this gives way to us understanding our position not to rule over them, but to care for them. The king will reply, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." At the height of the fall into sin, God tells Adam that he is of nature and he will return to nature in his death. It's this melancholy verse that reminds us of our humanity. It's repeated at Ash Wednesday services across several Christian denominations.
Ash Wednesday is the beginning of the season of Lent. So it is not in the Bible, but something that's been created when the traditions of the church year were created. And so Ash Wednesday is a day where people remember how humble we are and how fragile we are and how much we need God. So, the name Ash Wednesday comes from ashes to ashes and dust to dust. God creates man out of the dust. And then on Ash Wednesday we say, "You are dust, and to dust you shall return." Or sometimes I've been in a congregation where we've said, "Child of dust, child of God," reminding ourselves of that humbleness and our connection to God.
What I observe are beautiful people who were created by the same breath that created the mountains, the flowers, the sun, the sky, and the creatures. Beautiful people with capacity for love, great capacity for change. I also observe overloads of information, of misinformation, and of confusion. Though there is bad, there are also just mistakes. There's burnout, there's distraction. Plastics get thrown in the trash, friends drive separately, plastic water bottles are chosen over reusables, trash tangles in weeds. We're a society of exhaustion and a need for convenience. With so much demanding our attention and perfection, it feels okay to let our environmentalism and our trash be dropped. But we have to understand that whatever happens to the water happens to the people. Whatever happens to the land happens to the people. And whatever happens to this earth happens to us.
Okay, so humanity's connection to nature is, speaking as environmental historian, depends on context, and context meaning what country, what time period. And so if we look at from a Western perspective, historically, human connection with nature has been one of domination and control. But I think historically, dominion is often understood of kind of a right, an obligation to control, manipulate, conquer nature. And so therefore what has evolved in the Western experience is a really separation between nature and human beings, to the point that that most human beings don't think about this relationship, this interaction. And although other, both Native American people and other peoples who began to realize this relationship, like the preservationists in the late 19th century, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring in 1962, I think really helped to change for modern society, that there's something missing in that kind of previous mentioning of that relationship between human beings and nature, in which Rachel Carson pointed out that DDT by poisoning birds eventually comes around full circle and poisons humanity. Understanding that relationship with nature, I think, is many times it goes down to, I call to a superficial aspect. So people will kind of pat themselves on the back if they recycle or, something like that. And I think that something that's much more meaningful and sustainable is a really holistic examination of your life and the choices that you make, and thinking, do I need to have all the things that I have? Because I think we're so materially conditioned that we need to think we need to have everything. And I think that recalculating that relationship can be actually one of the most positive things that you can do in terms of reducing one's footprint upon nature. Going green is also a very complicated issue, because going green still requires the use of resources. And it raises this question, where do those resources come from? And we also know that the extraction of resources to build solar panels, electric batteries, is that those raw materials come from places and people that have historically have already paid the price of environmental injustice. And so even the notion of a more positive relationship with nature is not straightforward. There are costs and issues that we often overlook, and that going green is a complicated process that can actually perpetuate existing social and economic and environmental injustices.
The idea that humanity is above nature, more important than nature, should have indiscriminate power over nature. It's consistent in feminist critique. There's notions that humanity is divided, that male-born people, or people with white skin, or people of higher socioeconomic status, or people who love only people of the opposite sex, have some sort of importance or power. They deserve more space in public, in nature. But with feminist theory, we begin to understand that these are just constructs that arise out of discomfort and hate. We try to divide and relate because we could not possibly comprehend differences as a reflection of our sameness. How we are actually more related, a mark of creation.
I was in biolab today and I was looking in the cockroach tank and there was a dead one, and so I picked her up, I asked my teacher, and I'm now burying her outside because I think there's an importance to take care of nature. Some people might just throw away a dead cockroach, and honestly that's valid too, but I am a person who connects deeply with nature and sees its inherent life and its inherent beauty, and I think it's important to respect it and to acknowledge it and treat it like one of God's creations. I think that sometimes we forget that there's also room for grief in science. It's okay to mourn the life of the little ones also lost.
With feminist theory and eco-theology, we begin to understand that humanity is one, creation is one, and all proclaim and exalt the Lord. The beauty, individuality, and patterns that are inscribed on humanity, on plants, on animals, on the stars, are signed with Christ's signature. And as is practiced to worship God and respect God, should be practiced to respect nature, respect humanity, lift up our siblings, lift up the world that births food and habitat and beauty, lift up ourselves. Nature exists not for our benefit, but because it does, just as we exist.